This is a completely fictional cinematic story created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. Do not reference or imply that this is based on real events, real people, or real stories. She didn't even look up from her phone. That was the part that would replay in Ethan Holloway's mind for days afterward. Not the words she used, not the smirk she threw at the security guard, not even the moment she pointed at the exit doors and said, loud enough for the entire marble lobby to hear, "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave before I have you escorted out." It was the phone. The fact that she couldn't be bothered to fully set it down. That this man standing in front of her desk, a man in a faded canvas jacket, jeans worn pale at the knees, and boots that had clearly seen actual mud, was so obviously beneath her attention that she managed the whole humiliation one-handed. Ethan Holloway, 54 years old, father of one, founder, chairman, and controlling shareholder of Vertex Dynamics, a company with offices in 11 countries, 4,300 employees, and a market valuation that had crossed $22 billion the previous fiscal quarter. He stood at the reception desk of his own headquarters and said nothing. He just watched her. And he decided quietly to see exactly how far this would go. If this kind of story moves you, the ones where the truth finally catches up, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning had started the way most of Ethan's mornings started when he was on the road, badly. He'd been up since 4:30 in a hotel room in Denver, fielding a call from the Vertex operations director in Singapore about a supply chain delay that had already pushed 2 product launches back by 6 weeks. He'd showered, skipped breakfast, driven 3 hours back toward the city in his pickup, a 2009 Silverado with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat permanently occupied by a cardboard box of files, a broken umbrella, and a baseball cap his son Marcus had left there 2 summers ago. And he'd arrived at Vertex Dynamics downtown headquarters at 11:47 in the morning looking exactly like what he was, a tired man who had been working since before sunrise and hadn't thought once about how he looked doing it. That was genuinely not unusual for Ethan. His COO, Raymond Park, had told him more than once, gently at first, then with increasing directness, that his appearance at company events made people uncomfortable. Not because Ethan looked bad, exactly, but because he looked wrong, like a contractor who'd wandered into a board meeting, like someone's uncle who'd shown up to the wrong building. "You're the founder," Raymond had said once, with the careful tone of a man trying not to say something offensive. "People have expectations." Of what? Of what a billionaire looks like. Ethan had thought about that for a moment. "I don't own anything that looks like a billionaire." "That," Raymond said, "is exactly the problem." Ethan hadn't changed anything. He'd spent the last 4 months doing what he did every few years, a quiet, unannounced circuit of Vertex's global offices. No advance notice, no PR team, no executive escort. He showed up as himself, which meant he showed up looking like a man who fixed things with his hands and drove trucks, and didn't particularly care what anyone thought of his jacket. He sat in break rooms and listened to employees talk. He reviewed internal complaint logs. He read exit interview transcripts that most senior leadership never touched. He asked questions that made middle managers nervous because they were too specific, because they came from someone who had actually read the documents. He had been doing this for 22 years. Since the beginning, when Vertex was 4 people in a converted warehouse, and Ethan was the one who drove the parts to the assembly line himself, because they couldn't afford a second delivery run. The company had changed. He wasn't always sure it had changed in the right ways, so he drove back to headquarters on a Tuesday morning in October with mud on his boots and a list of questions in his head and absolutely no intention of announcing himself. The Vertex Dynamics lobby was beautiful in the way that expensive lobbies always were, a little cold, a little too vertical, designed to impress rather than welcome. 40-foot ceilings. A waterfall feature along the east wall that Ethan had never approved but hadn't gotten around to removing. Marble floors polished to a reflective shine. The company logo rendered in brushed steel above the reception desk, each letter 3 feet tall. Ethan had walked through that lobby 600 times. Easy. He walked through it now and went straight to reception. The desk was a long, curved structure of glass and white composite, staffed by two people. A young man on the far left who appeared to be on a call, headset in, back half turned, and a woman in the center, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, a blazer that probably cost more than Ethan's entire outfit, who was looking at her phone with the concentrated focus of someone doing something they considered important. Ethan stopped at the desk. He waited. She didn't look up. "Hi," Ethan said. She held up one finger. Not rudely, exactly. Or maybe exactly rudely. It was the kind of gesture that depended entirely on who you were doing it to. He waited another 30 seconds. "Hi," he said again. She looked up. Her eyes did the thing eyes do when they make a rapid, involuntary assessment, and they landed on the jacket, the jeans, the boots, the general absence of anything that read as important. And her expression settled into something that wasn't quite contempt, but was definitely its smaller, lazier cousin. "Can I help you?" she said. The phrasing was technically polite. The tone was not. "I'm here to access the executive floor," Ethan said. 42nd. She blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need an appointment." "Sir?" She set the phone down, finally, and folded her hands on the desk with the patience of someone who had explained things to confused people before and expected to do it again. "Everyone requires an appointment or a verified visitor pass to access the executive floors. That's company policy." "I'm aware of the policy," Ethan said. "I wrote it." She stared at him. "I'm sorry?" "The visitor protocol. Third revision, about 6 years ago. I was in the meeting where we finalized it." He paused. "Could you call up to the 42nd floor and let them know I'm here?" She looked at him for a long moment. Not the kind of look that meant she was considering the request, the kind that meant she was deciding how to phrase the refusal. "Sir, I'm going to need some form of identification." "Sure." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced his wallet, an old leather billfold worn at the corners, and from it, a Vertex Dynamics internal ID card. Not a visitor pass, not a contractor badge, an employee ID, blue-bordered, with his photograph and the designation printed clearly below his name. She looked at it. She looked at him. She looked at it again. "This doesn't have an access tier listed," she said. "Those cards don't list tiers. They never have." He kept his voice even. "The tier is verified in the system when you scan it. If you scan it, it'll show you everything you need." She did not reach for the scanner. "Sir," she said, and now there was something harder behind the politeness, something that had decided this interaction was over. "I don't know where you got this card, but I cannot verify your identity based on something that could very easily be what?" She stopped. "Fabricated," she finished, quieter, but she finished it. Ethan looked at her. "You think I fabricated a Vertex employee ID to get into a building? I'm saying I can't verify it by scanning it, sir, which you haven't done. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the desk." Whooped up. The security guard's name, Ethan would learn later, was Dale Pruitt. He was 61, had worked the Vertex lobby for 9 years, and wore the particular expression of a man who had seen a lot of confrontations and preferred for all of them to end quietly. He appeared at Ethan's elbow with his hands at his sides, not aggressive, just present. "Is there a problem?" Dale asked, and he was asking both of them, which Ethan noted. This gentleman, the receptionist whose lanyard identified her as Kara R., guest services lead, said the word gentleman in a way that used it as a synonym for person causing trouble, is claiming he needs executive floor access and is presenting an ID I can't verify. "May I?" Dale said, looking at Ethan. Ethan handed over the card. Dale looked at it. His face did something complicated and brief that he quickly put away. "Sir," Dale said, "could you come with me for a moment? We can get this sorted out." "I'd rather it be sorted out here," Ethan said. "Not difficult, just clear. I've asked twice to have someone call the 42nd floor. That's all I need." "I understand, sir. Let me—" "Dale," Kara's voice sharpened. "We have a protocol." "I know the protocol," Dale said. Not sharply, just stating it. "Then you know unauthorized individuals." "I know the protocol," he said again, and there was something in the repetition that quietly told her he was not going to keep being interrupted. He turned back to Ethan. Let me try to reach the executive coordinator, sir. That's the fastest path here. Will you give me just a couple of minutes? I'll give you as long as you need, Ethan said. Well, he waited. He was good at waiting. He'd spent most of his career waiting, for funding that might not come, for regulatory approvals that took 2 years longer than anyone projected, for partners who were on the fence to make up their minds. Patience was not a virtue Ethan had been born with, but it was one he'd been ground into him over 22 years of building something that had no guarantee of working. He stood to the side of the reception desk and watched the lobby. It was a Tuesday, late morning, so there was a reasonable amount of foot traffic. Employees with badges swiping through the turnstiles, visitors being checked in at the desk, delivery personnel with hand trucks heading toward the service corridor. Nobody looked at him for more than a second. Or rather, a few people looked at him, registered something that didn't fit, and looked away. That particular quality of not fitting that happened when someone's appearance didn't match their surroundings. Ethan was familiar with it. He'd felt it the first time he ever walked into a bank to apply for a business loan, 26 years old, wearing the best shirt he owned, which was not very good, and watched the loan officer's face do the same rapid assessment Kara's had done this morning. He'd gotten the loan. Eventually. After the third application. After the officer finally read the business plan instead of looking at the man holding it. The lobby buzzed quietly around him. 3 minutes passed. Dale came back with a look on his face that said the call had not gone the way he'd hoped. The executive coordinator isn't picking up, he said, keeping his voice low. I left a message. I also tried the general line for the 42nd floor and got voicemail. He paused. I'm sorry, sir. I don't have another way to verify. What about the ID scanner? Ethan said. Dale glanced toward the desk. Kara has final say on visitor processing, he said, which was not an answer to the question but was clearly the honest one. All right, Ethan said. Is there a manager I can speak to? The manager who arrived was named Kevin Solis. He was 34, had the posture of someone who had recently been promoted and hadn't yet figured out what to do with the authority, and he came down from the second floor still buttoning his jacket, which suggested he'd been caught off guard. He assessed the situation in about 4 seconds. Kara behind the desk with her arms crossed, Dale standing to the side with carefully neutral body language, a man in a work jacket standing in the lobby, and his expression made a decision. Sir, he said, coming to stop a few feet away, I understand there's been some confusion. Not from my end, Ethan said. Kevin blinked. I'm sorry? I'm not confused. I know who I am and why I'm here. I've been asking for someone to call the executive floor for about 15 minutes. That's all I've asked. Right, but Kevin glanced at Kara, who gave a small, almost invisible shake of her head. We have a verification process here, and without an appointment or a pre-registered visitor pass, I can't authorize access to restricted floors. I'm not a visitor, Ethan said. Sir, I work here. I've worked here since the building was built. Before the building was built. He kept his hands loose at his sides, kept his voice level. I have an employee ID. I've offered it twice. Your security protocol requires scanning it, not eyeballing it. If someone scans that card, this conversation ends in about 10 seconds. Kevin looked at the card, which Dale was still holding. He looked at it the same way Kara had, with the instinctive skepticism of someone whose gut was telling him that the person in front of him didn't belong, and who was finding reasons to justify the feeling rather than test it. I'd need to verify the card through our HR system before I could. You have access to the HR system? Well, a pause. Not directly, but do you have a computer? Sir, I'm trying to help you, but I need you to understand that we have security procedures in place for a reason, and those procedures exist to protect the people in this building. From what? Ethan said. From a middle-aged man with muddy boots who keeps asking to make a phone call? Kevin's jaw tightened slightly. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises, he said. If you believe your access has been incorrectly denied, you can contact our HR department and I'd like to speak to your supervisor, Ethan said. Kevin looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing whether patience was worth continuing. I'll see what I can do, he said, and the tone of it suggested that what he could do might take a while. The lobby continued around them. A woman in a gray coat walked past wheeling a presentation board. 2 engineers in Vertex lanyards crossed toward the elevators, arguing about something in low, urgent voices. A FedEx driver dropped 3 packages at the service window and left without making eye contact with anyone. Dale Pruitt had not left. He was standing slightly behind Ethan and to the left, not close enough to seem threatening, not far enough to seem disengaged, just there, present. Ethan had noticed that Dale, over the course of all of this, had not once spoken to him with the particular condescension that everyone else had. Not the polished corporate version of it, not the impatient version, none of it. He'd been careful and honest and had tried to actually solve the problem. "You don't have to stay," Ethan said quietly. Dale looked at him. "I'm on lobby duty," he said. "Right." A pause. "For what it's worth," Dale said, even quieter, "I tried the scan." Ethan looked at him. "When I had the card, I put it near the reader. It lit green." Dale looked straight ahead, face neutral. "I didn't say anything because—" He stopped. "Because Kara has final say on visitor processing," Ethan said. "Yeah." They stood together in the lobby of Vertex Dynamics, its chairman and its security guard, and neither of them said anything else for a moment. The senior administrator who came down 20 minutes later was named Patricia Ellsworth, and she had the energy of someone who considered herself the last reasonable adult in any given room. She was 50-ish, silver-streaked hair, a tablet tucked under one arm, and she took one look at Ethan and one look at the assembled cluster of Kevin and Kara and Dale and another manager who had appeared at some point and said, "What on earth is going on down here?" Kara explained. Kevin added context. The other manager said something about protocol. Patricia listened with the expression of someone being briefed on a crisis that was actually quite small, sighed through her nose, and turned to Ethan. "Sir," she said, and she at least met his eyes directly when she said it, which was more than most of them had managed. "I apologize for the inconvenience. However, I have to be honest with you. Without a verifiable appointment or an escort from an internal employee who can vouch for your presence, I cannot authorize access to restricted floors. That is our policy, and it exists for good reason." "I understand the policy," Ethan said. "I helped write it. My name is Ethan Holloway. I'd appreciate it if someone would call the 42nd floor. Sir." Her voice was patient but final, the way a door is final. "I've heard the claim. I'm sure you can understand that we receive a number of individuals who—" "Who what?" he said. She paused. "Who claim to be someone they're not," she finished carefully. "And your protocol for distinguishing between them," Ethan said, "is to not scan the ID card, not call the floor being requested, and not access the HR system, and simply ask the person to leave." She didn't answer that directly. "I think it would be best," she said, "if you came back at another time with documentation that can be more easily—" "Patricia," the voice came from behind her. Everyone turned. Victoria Hale, CEO of Vertex Dynamics, was crossing the lobby from the elevator bank, still pulling her badge lanyard back over her head, as if she'd just come from somewhere in a hurry. She was 51, trim, with the focused bearing of someone who ran 45 minutes every morning, not for wellness, but because she needed somewhere to put the energy. She looked at the assembled group. She looked at Ethan. Something passed across her face, fast, controlled. And then she looked at Patricia and raised an eyebrow. "What's the situation?" Victoria asked. "We have a gentleman who—" Patricia began. "I'll handle it," Victoria said. "Thank you." Patricia hesitated for exactly 1 second, then nodded and stepped back. Victoria walked toward Ethan. She stopped 2 feet away. She looked at him. Really looked. The kind of look that had nothing to do with his jacket or his boots. And then she looked, very briefly, at his right hand. He shook his head. A small movement. Her eyes came back to his face. She understood. "I'm sorry for the wait," Victoria said, and her voice was so professionally neutral it could have meant anything. "Why don't I walk you through?" "In just a moment," Ethan said. He turned back to the lobby, to Kara behind her desk, to Kevin still standing with his jacket half-buttoned, to Patricia with her tablet, to the other manager whose name he hadn't caught, to Dale Pruitt standing slightly apart from all of them. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. "I just need to make a quick call," he said. He dialed a number. It rang twice. "Raymond," he said when it connected. "I'm in the lobby. Go ahead and push the announcement." He ended the call. For a moment, nothing happened. The lobby continued. Footsteps on marble, the low murmur of conversations, the distant hum of the waterfall feature. And then every screen in the building. The digital displays above the reception desk, the information boards flanking the elevator banks, The large format monitor on the east wall that usually cycled through company news and financial metrics went dark for half a second. And then they came back up. Same photograph on all of them. A man in a canvas jacket, taken some years ago at a groundbreaking ceremony. Below it, in the clean professional font, Vertex used for official communications. Ethan Holloway, founder, executive chairman and controlling shareholder. Vertex Dynamics. The lobby went quiet. Not immediately. Sound doesn't stop all at once. It tapered, conversations trailing off, footsteps slowing, the low ambient noise of 40 people gradually draining into something that felt, to everyone standing in it, like the floor had shifted under their feet. Kara stared at the screen above her desk. Kevin's hand stopped moving on his jacket button. Patricia Ellsworth's tablet dropped 2 inches before she caught it. Ethan put his phone back in his pocket. He stood in the lobby of the company he had built, stood in it with mud on his boots and a coffee stain on his left cuff, and 22 years of early mornings accumulated somewhere behind his eyes. And he looked at the faces around him as the understanding moved through each one like water finding its level. Nobody spoke. He didn't speak either. He let the silence do what silence does when the truth finally arrives, which is to say, he let it settle. Let it become the whole room. Let everyone in it sit with what they'd done and what they'd assumed and how fast they'd done both. Dale Pruitt, standing to the side, was looking at the floor. Victoria was watching Ethan with her hands clasped in front of her, expression composed, giving nothing away. Ethan looked around the lobby one more time. At the marble floors. At the waterfall he'd never approved. At the brushed steel letters of his company's name mounted 40 feet above the place where he'd just been told, by the people who worked for him, to leave. He took a slow breath. He'd come here today to find out what was wrong with this company. He'd found out faster than he expected. The silence in the lobby didn't break so much as it cracked, slowly, in pieces, the way ice does when the temperature shifts and you can hear it happening before you see it. The first sound was someone's heel on the marble floor, a shift of weight, then a cough from somewhere near the elevator bank. Then the low, almost inaudible sound of Kara's chair rolling back an inch as she instinctively put distance between herself and the reception desk, as if the desk itself had become dangerous. Ethan didn't move. He stood in the same spot he'd stood in for the last 40 minutes, slightly to the right of the reception counter, in the space between the desk and the turnstiles where visitors waited to be cleared. And he looked at the screens. Not at the people, at the screens. At his own photograph up there in the company font, his name and title laid out in the clean, unambiguous language of official record. He looked at it for a few seconds the way you look at something that confirms what you already knew. Then he looked back at the room. Patricia Ellsworth had gone the color of old chalk. She was holding her tablet with both hands now, gripping it the way people grip things when they need something solid to hold on to, and her mouth was open approximately a quarter inch. Not enough to say anything, just enough to indicate that her brain was attempting to form words and failing. Kevin Solis had finished buttoning his jacket. Automatically, the way hands do things when the mind has gone somewhere else entirely. He was staring at the monitor above the east wall waterfall, and there was something in his face that was not quite shame and not quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Kara had set her phone face down on the desk. It was a small gesture, probably involuntary. But Ethan noticed it. Victoria Hale stood to his left, hands still clasped, and her expression had not changed. The professional composure of a woman who had sat through enough board crises to know that the worst thing you could do in a moment like this was let your face become readable. But her eyes moved once, briefly, to Ethan's profile, and what was in them was not surprise. It was something more like the particular exhaustion of someone who had suspected something was wrong for a long time and was now watching the confirmation arrive. Dale Pruitt was still looking at the floor. The waterfall continued on the east wall, indifferent. Ethan turned to Victoria. "Is there a conference room available?" he asked. His voice was the same as it had been for the last 40 minutes, measured, unhurried, without any performance of what this moment was. "Somewhere with a table." "Third floor," Victoria said. "The Meridian room should be open." "Good." He looked at the group, Kara, Kevin, Patricia, the unnamed manager who had materialized at some point and was now visibly trying to remember whether he'd said anything he'd regret. I'd like everyone who was involved in this morning's situation to come up in 20 minutes. Don't send apologies or substitutes. Come yourselves. He said it the way he said most things, without elevation, without drama, just the plain shape of a request that was not actually a request. Then he walked toward the elevator bank. Dale stepped forward, out of habit or instinct or some combination of both, and held the turnstile gate open. "Thank you, Dale," Ethan said. Dale nodded once. "Yes, sir." The elevator doors opened. Ethan got in. The doors closed behind him, and the lobby, which had been holding its breath, released it all at once. The Meridian Conference Room on the third floor was a rectangle of glass and white walls with a long table, 12 chairs, and a window that looked out over the parking structure. Not the dramatic city view that the upper floors had, but honest, functional. Ethan had always liked this room for that reason. The view from the 42nd floor was too easy to get lost in. He sat at the far end of the table and took out his phone and called Raymond Park. Raymond picked up on the first ring. He had probably been sitting with the phone in his hand since the announcement went out. "How bad is it?" Raymond asked, skipping hello entirely. "Define bad." "Ethan." "Nobody touched me," Ethan said. "Nobody was aggressive. It wasn't—" He paused, finding the right word. "Malicious." "It was something worse than malicious." A beat of silence on Raymond's end. "What was it?" "Reflexive," Ethan said. "That's the problem. Nobody made a decision this morning. They just reacted. Every single one of them took one look and decided the answer was no before they'd asked a single question. And then they kept deciding it, over and over, even when I gave them easy off-ramps." He leaned back in the chair. "That doesn't happen because people are bad at their jobs. It happens because something in the culture taught them that was the right answer." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me right now?" "Security footage. Everything from lobby coverage from 8 a.m. to noon. And the card scan log. I want to see what came up when Dale ran my badge near the reader." "Dale ran your badge?" "Informally. He didn't enter it into the system, but I want to confirm what I think I already know." "I'll get it pulled." A pause. "Are you going to talk to Victoria?" "Already saw her," Ethan said. "She knew who I was." Another pause, longer. "And she didn't say anything?" "I asked her not to. I wanted to see how the staff handled it." He turned his phone over in his hand, a habit from years ago that he'd never shaken. "She handled herself well, considering. She came down when she didn't have to. That's worth something." "Okay," Raymond said. "I'll have the footage sent to your tablet. Do you want anyone from legal in that meeting?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "This isn't a legal conversation. Not yet." He hung up. He sat in the Meridian room and looked at the parking structure through the window. The ordinary, unglamorous grid of concrete levels and vehicles. And he thought about his son Marcus, who was 11 years old and currently at school 20 minutes from this building, and who had asked him 2 weekends ago, in the particular blunt way that 11-year-olds ask things, "Dad, when you go to work, do people know who you are?" Ethan had said yes. He'd said it without thinking. He'd said it because it was technically true. Within the company, his name was known. His photograph was in the annual report. His signature was on the founding documents that hung framed in the 42nd floor reception area. He thought about that answer now and found it less adequate than it had seemed 2 weekends ago. They came in one at a time, or nearly, Kara and Kevin arriving within seconds of each other, not together by design, but by the accident of taking the same elevator, which had made the ride up awkward enough that both of them entered the room without making eye contact with anything but the middle distance. Patricia came in 90 seconds later with her tablet, which she set on the table and did not open. The unnamed manager, who turned out to be Marcus Webb, Deputy Director of Facilities Administration, a title that explained both his presence and his ability to contribute very little, arrived last and took the seat closest to the door. Victoria came in and sat 2 chairs down from Ethan at his right. She poured herself water from the pitcher on the table without offering it to anyone else, which was either rudeness or nerves, and Ethan suspected it was nerves. Nobody spoke first. This was something Ethan had noticed in every management situation he'd ever been in. Nobody wanted to speak first when they knew they were in trouble, because speaking first meant giving the other person something to respond to, and responding was the part that was going to hurt. He let the silence sit for another few seconds, long enough to feel slightly uncomfortable, and then he said, Tell me how this morning looked from your side. He wasn't addressing anyone specific. He let that be part of it. Kara looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Ethan and appeared to make a decision. We followed protocol, she said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness of someone who had decided that the best available position was professionalism. The visitor verification procedure requires appointment confirmation or escort authorization for access to restricted floors. The individual presenting to... She stopped herself, recalibrated. You were presenting without an appointment, without a pre-registered pass, and with an ID that our front desk staff couldn't immediately verify. Why couldn't they verify it? Ethan asked. Because... She glanced at Kara, a brief involuntary thing. Because the verification requires a badge scan, and the determination was made not to process the scan pending... Pending what? Silence. Pending what, Patricia? She set her hands flat on the table. Pending a visual assessment of the situation. Ethan looked at her. A visual assessment? Yes. And what did the visual assessment determine? She didn't answer. He looked at Kara. What did the visual assessment determine? Kara was 26 years old and had been the guest services lead for 14 months, and she was sitting in a conference room across from the founder of the company she worked for. And she looked, Ethan thought, not entirely unlike how he'd looked at 26 in that bank loan office, aware that the version of the world she'd been operating in had just been revised, and not yet certain what the new version required of her. That you didn't look like... She stopped. Like what? She pressed her lips together for a second. Like someone who would need to be on the executive floor. The room was quiet. Kevin Solis shifted in his chair. It was the sound that happened when someone wanted to say something and was talking themselves out of it. So Ethan looked at him and said, "Go ahead." Kevin exhaled. "I want to say for the record that I was working with limited information when I came down. Kara had flagged a situation and I responded to her assessment. I didn't have independent..." "You had an ID card," Ethan said. "You had a man who was calm, who was giving you a specific and verifiable claim, who offered multiple ways to verify it, and who asked you repeatedly for one thing, to make a phone call. You had all of that. What was the independent information you were missing?" Kevin opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm not asking rhetorically," Ethan said. "I genuinely want to know. What was the piece of information that, if you'd had it, would have changed your response?" The silence that followed was a different quality from the lobby silence. That one had been shock, the sudden revision of reality. This one was something more uncomfortable. This was the silence of people being asked to articulate something they'd done instinctively, and discovering that instinct, when described out loud, sounded exactly like what it was. "The way you were dressed," Kevin said finally. He said it quietly. "The way you say something when you know it's true and know it's bad, and have decided that honesty is the only thing left you have to offer." Ethan nodded. Not the nod of a man who was surprised, the nod of a man who had been waiting for someone to say the true thing. "That's honest," he said. "I appreciate that." He looked around the table. "Anyone else want to add to that?" Marcus Webb, the facilities deputy director, cleared his throat. "I think there's a legitimate argument that in a high-security environment, physical presentation is one data point among several that trained staff can reasonably..." "Dale ran my badge," Ethan said, "informally, without entering it into the system, because the desk had declined to use the scanner. It came up green. He didn't say anything because he didn't have the authority to override the decision that had already been made. Does that affect the argument about trained staff and data points?" Marcus Webb did not finish his argument. Ethan looked at Victoria. She had been quiet through all of this, present, listening, but contained, doing what she did, which was gather information before she said anything. "Victoria," he said, "when you walked into the lobby and saw the situation, what did you see?" She was quiet for a moment, not constructing an evasion, deciding how precise to be. "I saw," she said carefully, "a situation that had already escalated past the point where it should have escalated. A man who had been waiting, by that point, for nearly 40 minutes. Multiple staff members involved, none of whom had taken the simplest available step to resolve it." She paused. "And I recognized you immediately, not from the canvas jacket. Why didn't you say anything? You shook your head. And if I hadn't?" She looked at him directly. I would have said something, she said. I was going to anyway. I was running a calculation about how to do it without... She stopped. Without what? Without making it worse, she said. For you or for them? He held her gaze for a moment. That's a complicated calculation. It was a complicated situation, she said, and I don't think I handled it perfectly. She said it plainly, without the defensive framing most people used when admitting fault, without the but that usually followed, just the admission, sitting there without decoration. Ethan nodded again, looked back at the table. I want to be clear about something, he said. I did not come back to this building this morning looking for a confrontation. I've been touring our offices for 4 months. I do it periodically. I do it without announcement because announced visits tell you what people want you to see, and I'm more interested in what's actually there. He paused. I parked in the structure, walked in through the front entrance, went to reception, and asked to go to the 42nd floor. That's the whole of what I did. Everything else that happened this morning was generated by this building, by the people in it, by whatever in our culture produced those responses. Patricia had opened her tablet. Not, it seemed, to look at it. More to have something to do with her hands. What are you intending to do with the security footage? She asked. Review it, Ethan said. All of it. I want a complete record of what happened from the time I walked in to the time the announcement went out. He looked around the table one more time. That footage is going to be reviewed by HR and by our legal team, and some decisions are going to be made based on what it shows. I want everyone in this room to know that before it happens, rather than after. That's the only reason I'm telling you. Kara had gone very still. Kevin was looking at the table. Patricia's hands on the tablet were not quite steady. Marcus Webb, who had clearly decided that his best strategy was architectural invisibility, had reduced himself to approximately the volume of a stack of papers. Only Dale? Dale wasn't in the room, Ethan realized. He hadn't asked Dale to come up. He made a mental note to correct that. One more question, Ethan said. And I want you to think about it before you answer because I'm going to ask it again later, in a different setting, and I'd like your answers to be consistent. He looked at each of them in turn. If I had actually been an ordinary visitor this morning, no ID, no claim to know anyone on the 42nd floor, just a man who walked in off the street and needed help, would any of you have treated me differently than you did? Nobody answered. That was itself an answer. He stayed in the Meridian room after they filed out. All of them quiet, all of them moving differently than they'd moved when they came in, waited with something that had no comfortable place to settle. He stayed and he looked at the parking structure and he thought about the question he'd just asked, and about the honest answer to it, which was probably not. Probably they would have treated an ordinary stranger the same way, which was, depending on how you looked at it, either marginally better or significantly worse than the alternative. Raymond's message came through on his tablet 20 minutes later. Footage attached, badge scan log attached, HR incident template attached. Ethan opened the badge scan log first. There it was. A timestamp, 11:52 a.m. A proximity read from the lobby scanner, his card. The result? Access authorized. Chairman, executive, green, clean, automatic. He looked at that for a long time. Then he opened the footage. The lobby camera had a wide angle, captured the whole of the reception area, the turnstiles, the seating near the east wall. He watched himself walk in, watched himself approach the desk, watched Kara look up, look at him, look at her phone, look back at him with that expression. He watched the whole 42 minutes. He watched Kevin button his jacket. He watched Patricia arrive with her tablet and her careful, competent, completely misapplied authority. He watched Dale, standing slightly apart, calm and steady and professionally correct throughout the entire thing. The only person in the whole building who had tried to actually scan the card, who had stayed when he didn't have to, who had spoken to Ethan without the particular edge that everyone else couldn't quite keep out of their voices. He paused the footage on a frame where Dale was standing just behind him. Not conspicuous, just there. And he thought about what that meant, in a company of 4,300 people, that the person who had done the right thing today was a 61-year-old man on hourly security wages who had probably never been invited to a meeting in this room in his life. He thought about Marcus Webb's argument, the one about physical presentation being a data point in a high-security environment. He thought about how neatly that argument explained everything that had happened this morning and how completely it failed to address anything that mattered about it. His phone buzzed. Marcus. His son, not Webb. Dad, are you picking me up today, or is it Claire? He looked at the message for a moment. The ordinary, specific, utterly human weight of an 11-year-old's after-school logistics cutting straight through the middle of everything else. Me, he typed. 4:30. Be out front. Okay, can we get food? Yes. The Thai place? Sure. He set the phone down. He looked at the paused footage on his tablet, the wide-angle lobby, the marble floors, the brushed steel letters of his company name, Dale Pruitt, standing in the background with his hands at his sides and his eyes forward. 4,300 people worked for Vertex Dynamics. This morning had introduced him, in about 42 minutes, to most of what he needed to know about what was wrong with the company he'd built. He closed the footage file and opened his notes. He had work to do. The notes Ethan made in the Meridian room that afternoon were not elegant. They never were. He wrote the way he thought, in fragments, in half-finished sentences, in questions that generated more questions. A legal pad, a pen that kept skipping, and 40 minutes of silence except for the occasional sound of the parking structure below. He wrote, "Who trained her?" Meaning Kara. Meaning who told her, explicitly or implicitly or by sustained example, that a visual assessment of a visitor was an acceptable substitute for the actual verification procedure that existed precisely because human visual assessments were unreliable and legally problematic and just fundamentally wrong. He wrote, Kevin came down and didn't ask a single question. That was the thing about Kevin that sat with him most, not the refusal, the absence of curiosity. He'd arrived in a situation, taken Kara's framing of it, and worked backwards from that framing without once pausing to gather his own data. That was not a Kevin Solis problem. That was a management culture problem. That was what happened when people were rewarded for decisiveness and speed and projecting confidence and quietly, slowly, over time stopped being rewarded for getting it right. He wrote, Patricia said the way you were dressed before Kevin did. She just used more words to say it. He looked at that line for a while. Then he wrote, Dale. And under that, nothing, because there wasn't a question there. There was just a man who had done his job correctly under conditions specifically designed, not intentionally, but effectively, to make doing it correctly difficult. That deserved something, but Ethan wasn't ready yet to decide what. He gathered the legal pad, capped the pen, and took the elevator to 42. The executive floor of Vertex Dynamics was a different ecosystem from the lobby, quieter, carpeted, with the specific hush of concentrated institutional power. The furniture was better up here, the lighting warmer, the air somehow more deliberate, as if even the ventilation system understood that important things happened on this floor and had adjusted its behavior accordingly. Ethan had always found it slightly ridiculous, which was probably why he spent as little time here as possible. His office was at the north end, corner, floor-to-ceiling windows. The city view Raymond had warned him people got lost in. He unlocked it himself, which took slightly longer than it should have because he'd been carrying the wrong keys for 3 days and hadn't gotten around to switching them. Small, stupid, human error. The kind of thing that happened when you were running on 4 hours of sleep and Denver hotel coffee. He sat down at his desk. His desk, which was covered in the sedimentary evidence of 8 weeks of absence, a stack of quarterly reports he'd asked to be printed rather than emailed, a coffee mug that someone had washed and left there, 3 external drives in a row, a framed photograph of Marcus at 9 years old standing in front of a Vertex assembly line, looking deeply unimpressed by the machinery but trying to hide it. He looked at the photograph for a moment. Marcus had asked, during that visit, why the robots didn't just do everything themselves. Ethan had said it was because some things still needed a person. Marcus had thought about that and said, like what? And Ethan had said, like deciding if the robots are doing the right thing. Marcus had seemed unsatisfied with that answer, which was fair because it was the kind of answer adults gave when they were tired. And the real answer was more complicated. He turned the photograph slightly so it faced more towards the window and pulled the quarterly reports toward him. He was 40 pages into the North American operations summary when Victoria knocked. She came in without waiting for an answer, which was her habit, and which he'd long since stopped minding, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, from somewhere, not the executive floor machine which produced something that was coffee-colored but not coffee-adjacent in any meaningful way. She set one in front of him and sat in the chair across the desk. The cups are from the second floor break room, she said. I didn't trust the machine up here. Smart, he said. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She was still in the same clothes she'd been in that morning. The kind of clothes you put on when you expect a full day of meetings, and then the day becomes something else entirely. She looked, Ethan thought, like someone who had been managing the aftermath of the lobby situation on top of whatever the rest of her day contained, and who had kept it together through both, and who was now in a room where she didn't have to keep it together quite as much, and was noticing how tired that made her. Raymond sent me the footage, she said. I figured he would. I watched it. She paused. All of it. Ethan drank his coffee. It was, in fact, considerably better than the machine. And it's worse than I thought it was when I was standing in it. She set her cup down. You can see the moment Kevin made his decision. It's in the first 3 seconds. He came off the elevator, scanned the room, saw Kara's posture, saw you, and the decision was made before he took 2 steps. She shook her head, a small, tired movement. He never even looked at the ID card. Dale's already holding it by then, and Kevin walks right past him without... She stopped. He just never even looked. I know, Ethan said. Patricia's the one I keep going back to, Victoria said. Because she's been here 11 years. She knows the verification procedure. She knows exactly what the badge scanner is for and why it exists. And she arrived and saw you and made the same call Kara made in the first 30 seconds, except she had 11 years of institutional knowledge available to her and used none of it. Ethan nodded. What are you going to do? Victoria asked. Direct, the way she asked most things. It was one of the reasons he'd hired her. She didn't use extra words when fewer would accomplish the same thing. I'm going to wait until HR has reviewed the footage and the scan log, he said, and then I'm going to make decisions based on what the review shows. And if I told you what I think it's going to show? I think I already know what it's going to show, Ethan said, but I want the process to happen correctly. I'm not going to make personnel decisions based on my personal experience of being insulted. I'm going to make them based on documented evidence reviewed through our actual disciplinary process. He paused. Even this morning. Victoria looked at him. Especially this morning, she said. Especially this morning, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the city was doing what it always did in the late afternoon. The light going amber at the edges, the street traffic thickening 17 floors below, the particular restless energy of a city moving toward the end of a workday. I owe you an apology, Victoria said. Ethan looked at her. When I walked into the lobby, she said, my first instinct was to identify myself, to say who you were and end it. I talked myself out of it because you signaled me not to, and I respected that. But I also talked myself out of it for another reason. She turned her cup on the desk, a slow quarter rotation. I thought about how it would look, getting involved in a lobby dispute, the optics of the CEO interceding personally in a visitor verification situation. A pause. I ran a political calculation in a moment that didn't require a political calculation. It required doing the right thing, and I added a step between seeing the right thing and doing it. Ethan was quiet for a few seconds. You came down, he said. I came down 4 minutes after I should have. How did you know it was happening? Dale called the executive coordinator. She wasn't at her desk, so he left a message, but the call registered and she saw it when she got back and flagged it to me. Took about 25 minutes from when it started. She paused. In 25 minutes, I should have been downstairs faster. Ethan held his coffee cup and didn't say anything for a moment. You're harder on yourself than the situation warrants, he said finally. Possibly, she said, but I'd rather err in that direction. He nodded. That, at least, he understood completely. At 4:15, he left the building through the parking structure rather than the lobby, which he recognized was probably avoidance, but which he also recognized he was doing consciously and decided was acceptable. He retrieved the Silverado from the 3rd level and drove the 20 minutes to Marcus's school, where Marcus was standing out front with his backpack hanging off one shoulder and his expression carrying the specific mild grievance of a kid who'd been waiting 5 minutes longer than expected. He got in and said, "You're late." "By 4 minutes," Ethan said. 5. 4.5. Marcus dropped his backpack on the floor, considered the coffee stain on his father's cuff, and said, "Did something happen today?" Ethan pulled out of the school drive. "Why?" "Because you have your work face on." I always have my work face on. No, you have your different work face, the one you get when something actually happened. Marcus turned to look out the passenger window. He'd always done that. Looked out the window when he was saying something he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to say directly. Was it bad? Ethan thought about the lobby. About 42 minutes of being told, without anyone quite saying it outright, that he did not appear to be the kind of person who mattered. About Kevin Solis's face. About the phone sitting face down on Kara's desk. It was informative, he said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That means it was bad. It means I learned something. What did you learn? Ethan stopped at a light. The late afternoon amber of it caught the dust on the windshield and made the whole cab briefly golden. That the company has a problem, he said, and that the problem is easier to see than I thought once you're standing in the right place to look at it. Marcus absorbed this with the particular seriousness he applied to his father's work conversations, which was something Ethan had noticed and quietly valued. That his son, at 11, treated being talked to honestly like a thing that was worth receiving carefully. Can you fix it? Marcus asked. I don't know yet, Ethan said. I think so. Most things can be fixed if you're willing to actually look at them. That's what you always say. Because it keeps being true. The light turned green. They drove toward the Thai place, and Marcus told him about his day, and Ethan listened. Actually listened, the way you listen when you've spent a day watching people fail to do it. And for about 45 minutes, the rest of it sat at a reasonable distance. The HR review took 2 days. It was thorough, which was what he'd asked for. Jenna O'Q, Vertex's chief human resources officer, ran it personally, reviewing the full footage, the badge scan logs, the visitor processing records for the relevant period, the employment files and performance records of everyone involved, and the written statements that everyone present had been asked to provide by end of business on the same day. Jenna was 53 and had the bearing of someone who did difficult things regularly and had stopped flinching while doing them, which Ethan had always considered one of her most valuable professional qualities. She came to his office on Thursday morning with a folder and the expression of someone who had formed clear conclusions and was prepared to state them without embellishment. The short version, she said, sitting across from him, is that the badge scan issue is unambiguous. Your ID card was a valid internal employee credential, highest access tier, and the proximity read at 11:52 confirms it was green authorized. The decision not to use the scanner was made by Kara Renner within the first 90 seconds of the interaction and was not revisited by any subsequent staff member who arrived on scene, despite at least 3 clear opportunities to do so. She opened the folder. Kevin Solis's statement says he deferred to Kara's assessment because she was the trained front desk staff, and he considered her the domain expert for visitor processing. Which would be a reasonable position, Ethan said, if Kara had actually processed. Correct, Jenna said. The verification procedure requires scanner confirmation as step 1. She skipped step 1. Everything else built on that. She turned a page. Patricia Ellsworth's statement is... She paused, choosing a word. More sophisticated. She argues that in the absence of scanner confirmation, the protocol permits managerial discretion in determining the appropriate next step, and that her determination was that the claims being made were sufficiently inconsistent with the available evidence to warrant declining access. What was the inconsistent evidence? Jenna looked at him over the top of the folder. Your appearance, she said. She doesn't use that word. She says presentation and contextual indicators and consistency of the overall profile, but that's what she means. Ethan nodded. Marcus Webb's statement is 3 sentences, Jenna continued. He arrived to assist with a visitor management situation, he deferred to the judgment of senior staff, and he has no additional information to provide. She turned another page. Which is probably the most honest document in this folder, even if it's honest about the wrong thing. What's your recommendation? Ethan asked. Jenna set the folder down. Kara Renner, termination. The skip of the scanner protocol was the foundational error, and her written statement doesn't demonstrate any understanding of why it was an error. She argues she was exercising appropriate judgment in a situation where the standard process felt insufficient. The fact that she frames it as judgment rather than failure is the part that concerns me most. You can train someone to follow a procedure. It's a lot harder to train someone to see where their judgment is coming from. Ethan nodded. Kevin Solis. I'm recommending formal written warning and mandatory retraining on visitor management and escalation protocols, with a 90-day performance review. She paused. I considered termination, but Kevin's statement, compared to the others, at least names the real thing. He said it was the way you were dressed. That took something, and his record before this is clean. I think there's something to work with. Another pause. I could be wrong. You could be, Ethan agreed. Go on. Patricia Ellsworth. I'm recommending termination. 11 years, senior title, access to all the relevant knowledge, and she chose the same answer as someone on her 14th month. She said it without satisfaction. Just the plain shape of a conclusion. The sophistication of her statement makes it worse, not better. She knows what the process requires. She's arguing for why her deviation from it was justified. That's a senior administrator in a high-access control environment constructing a rationale for why rules don't apply when she's decided they don't. That's not fixable with retraining. The room was quiet for a moment. Marcus Webb, Jenna said, I'm recommending a formal record of the incident in his file and a written acknowledgement that his failure to independently assess the situation or advocate for proper procedure was a dereliction of his managerial responsibility. No termination. But it's on the record. And Dale Pruitt, Ethan said. Jenna paused. Dale is not the subject of a disciplinary review, she said carefully. He followed procedure as best he was able within the constraints of the situation. He attempted a badge proximity read. He remained present and professional throughout. She looked at him. If anything, I'd say Dale's file deserves a note of the opposite kind. It will get one, Ethan said. More than a note. Jenna gathered the folder. She started to rise, then stopped. Can I say something off the record? He gestured. I've been in HR for 27 years, she said. I've seen a lot of incidents. Mostly people do what they did because of individual failure, bad judgment, bad day, bad character. This one is different. This one is, she considered, structural. What happened in that lobby happened too smoothly, too quickly. Everyone made the same call from the same information without hesitation. That's not a coincidence of 4 people being wrong. That's a system that's been quietly teaching people what the right answer looks like. She paused. The terminations are appropriate, but they're not enough. I know, Ethan said. She nodded and left. He sat with the folder she'd left behind, the statements, the scan logs, the incident timeline, and he thought about the word she'd used, structural. The kind of problem that doesn't live in any one person, doesn't resolve when any one person is removed, because it lives in the spaces between people, in the unwritten rules, in what gets rewarded and what gets ignored, and what everybody just gradually comes to understand is how things work here. He'd built this company. He'd built everything in it, or overseen the building of it, which at this scale amounted to the same thing. And somewhere in the building of it, something had gotten in that he hadn't put there, or something he'd put there had evolved into something he hadn't intended, and now it was in the culture the way a splinter gets into wood, invisible until you push on it, and then suddenly the only thing you can feel. His phone rang. Raymond. The footage review is done, Raymond said. Jenna's report matches what I saw. Do you want me to draft the communication for the affected staff? I'll draft it myself, Ethan said. A pause. Ethan, I'll draft it myself, he said again. Not harshly, just firm. I'm not going to have other people write the consequences for something I watched happen. That's my name on this company. I'll put my name on this too. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Okay. And Raymond, I need you to set up a separate meeting with Dale Pruitt, just him and me, tomorrow morning if he's on shift. He's on shift at 7. 7:30, Ethan said. Here, or wherever he's comfortable. His choice. I'll set it up. A pause. Anything else? Ethan looked out the windows at the city, which had moved into evening while he wasn't paying attention. The amber gone, the lights coming up in the buildings across the street. That particular shift in the quality of the dark that happened between late afternoon and actual night. Start pulling everything we have on our visitor management training materials, he said. Every module, every onboarding script, every policy document, going back 5 years. I want to see exactly what we've been telling people and how we've been telling it. That's going to be a significant volume of material. Good, Ethan said. I want to see all of it. He hung up. He went back to his notes from the Meridian room, the legal pad with the skipping pen and the fragments. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote, at the top, in letters large enough that he wouldn't be able to talk himself out of taking them seriously. What did we teach them? Not who did wrong. Not who gets fired. Those were settled, or close to it, and they were the simple part. The hard part was the question underneath. What had this company been teaching in its procedures, in its culture, in the daily unspoken weight of what behavior got recognized and what behavior got corrected, that had produced 4 people who all arrived at the same wrong answer with such confidence and such speed? He didn't have the answer yet, but he'd been building things long enough to know that you don't find the answer by sitting in a corner office looking at the city. You find it by getting close to the thing that broke and staying close until you understand exactly how it broke and exactly why nobody noticed while it was breaking. He picked up his pen. He started writing. Dale Pruitt arrived at 7:28. Ethan knew this because he was already in the small conference room on the 2nd floor. Not the Meridian room, not the executive floor, not anywhere that would require Dale to badge up or be escorted or navigate the particular social geography of spaces he didn't usually occupy. When he heard the knock. 2 knocks, measured, the kind a person gives when they're not sure if knocking is the right thing to do, but they're going to do it correctly regardless. "Come in," Ethan said. Dale came in wearing his uniform, the Vertex security jacket, the lanyard, the whole of it, and he held his cap in his hands the way men of his generation sometimes held hats in situations they weren't certain how to read. He looked at Ethan across the small table, and he looked at the 2 cups of coffee already there, and he looked at the table itself, and then he said, "Mr. Holloway," in the voice of a man who had been practicing a version of that sentence since Raymond called the previous afternoon. "Ethan," Ethan said. Dale blinked. "Sit down, Dale. Coffee's from the 2nd floor break room. I'm told it's better than the machine upstairs." Dale sat. He wrapped his hands around the cup without drinking from it, which was the body language of a man who needed something to hold but wasn't ready to be comfortable yet. Ethan looked at him directly. "You know why I asked you here?" "I have some idea," Dale said. "Tell me your version of Tuesday," Ethan said, "from the beginning." Dale looked at his coffee. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone constructing a story, but the silence of someone deciding how honest to be and landing on completely. "You came in at 11:40-something, he said. "I was doing a lobby walkthrough. I wasn't at the desk. That's Kara's station. But I was in the area when she flagged me." He paused. "She didn't flag me with words. She just looked at me in a way that meant she wanted backup. I've been doing this 9 years. I know the look." "What did you think when you first saw the situation?" Ethan asked. Dale turned the cup slowly on the table. "Honestly? Please." "I thought it was one of 2 things," Dale said. "Either there was a real issue, someone who shouldn't be there, or it was a verification problem that was going to get resolved in about 30 seconds once somebody scanned the badge." He paused. "I knew pretty fast which one it was." "How?" "Because of the way you talked," Dale said simply. "Not what you said. How you said it. People who are trying to get somewhere they shouldn't be don't argue procedure. They don't ask you to make phone calls. They get louder or they get slippery." He shook his head. "You just kept asking for the reasonable thing, the same reasonable thing over and over. That's not how trouble talks." Dale nodded. He didn't look surprised that Ethan knew. "I put it near the reader when I was holding it. Not a full scan. I didn't enter it into the system. But I got close enough to get a read." He looked up. "Green. Highest tier." "Why didn't you say anything?" Dale looked at him steadily. "Because by the time I got the read, Kara had already decided. Kevin had already decided. And I'm a security guard on hourly wages and their management. And in this company, in most companies probably, that hierarchy doesn't move sideways." He paused. "I tried to get you to a phone call. That was the best I could do without going over heads in a way that would have..." He stopped. "In a way that would have what?" Dale looked at his coffee. "Created problems for me," he said. Quiet. Direct. Honest in a way that clearly cost him something to say to this particular man. "I've got 7 years until retirement. I've got a mortgage that's 3 years from being done. I've got a wife with a hip replacement coming up in the spring that we've been saving toward for 2 years. He looked up. "I knew what was right. I also knew what the consequences of doing it fully would probably be. And I split the difference, and I've been thinking about that split ever since." The room held that for a moment. Ethan didn't say anything immediately. He drank his coffee. He thought about what it cost a man to say that. To sit across from his company's founder and admit clearly and without excuse that fear had governed a piece of his conduct, not defensiveness, not rationalization, just the plain truth of it, laid on the table. "I appreciate that," Ethan said finally. Dale nodded once, tight. "It doesn't change what I did." "No," Ethan agreed. "It doesn't. But it changes what I understand about why. And that matters to me." He set his cup down. "I'm not here to discipline you, Dale. I want to be clear about that. What you did Tuesday was as close to correct as the situation permitted someone in your position to get. You stayed. You tried the scanner. You talked to me like a person." He paused. "That last one sounds like a low bar." "It wasn't, on Tuesday." Dale was quiet. "I want to talk about what comes next," Ethan said. "For you specifically, and for this company generally. But before I do, is there anything you want to say? Anything about Tuesday that you feel hasn't been heard yet?" Dale turned the cup one more time. "I was thinking, not performing thought, actually thinking, the way someone does when they've been waiting for a question and want to answer it right." "There's one thing," he said. "Go ahead." "It wasn't just Tuesday," Dale said. "I want you to understand that. Tuesday was specific because it was you, and because the gap between who you were and how you were being treated was obvious. But the thing underneath Tuesday, the way staff here read people when they come in, how fast they make decisions, who gets the scanner and who gets asked to leave, that's every day." He paused. "I've watched it for 9 years. It's not every interaction, it's not even most of them, but it's enough of them that I stopped being surprised by it somewhere around year 3. He looked at Ethan. "I should have been more surprised by it than I was. That's the part I keep thinking about." Ethan held that answer for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." The formal notifications went out that same morning. Ethan had drafted them himself the night before, sitting at the kitchen table after Marcus went to bed, a glass of water at his elbow and the legal pad in front of him, and 3 false starts in the recycling bin. He wrote them plainly, not punitively, not with the particular institutional coldness that termination letters sometimes carried, but directly. "Your employment with Vertex Dynamics is being terminated, effective immediately, as a result of your conduct on October 14th, which constituted a failure to follow established visitor verification protocol and a demonstrated pattern of decision-making inconsistent with the standards of professional conduct expected of Vertex employees." He wrote the same essential letter twice, with specific modifications for Kara and Patricia. He wrote Kevin's warning notice with the same directness. He wrote Marcus Webb's formal record notation and read it back 3 times before he was satisfied. It said what it needed to say without either overstating or minimizing. He sent them to Jenna at 11 the previous night with a note that said, "These go out tomorrow morning. Review for any process issues and let me know before 9. Jenna had written back at 11:40. "No process issues. These are fair." And then, after a pause that Ethan could reconstruct from the timestamp, "The tone is better than I expected. I mean that as a compliment." He'd read that and gone to bed. The notifications were hand-delivered by HR at 9:15 Thursday morning, while Ethan was still in his conversation with Dale. He knew the approximate timing Raymond had coordinated, and he'd made a deliberate choice not to be in the building when it happened, not out of avoidance, out of the understanding that his presence would make it about him. And it wasn't about him. It was about a clear record of consequences for documented conduct, carried out through proper process. His face attached to it turned a personnel action into a spectacle, and the situation had already generated enough spectacle for 1 week. Kara Renner received hers at her apartment. She'd been placed on administrative leave the previous day, which meant she wasn't in the building. She called her union representative within an hour, which was her right. The union representative reviewed the footage and the scan log and called back 40 minutes later to say there wasn't a viable grievance. Patricia Ellsworth was in the building when hers was delivered, at her desk on the 4th floor, which meant she had to carry it through the office to get to the elevator. Jenna later told Ethan that Patricia had read it, folded it once, put it in her bag, and left without speaking to anyone. No scene, no confrontation, just the particular dignity of someone who had decided that however she felt, she was going to walk out of this building upright. Ethan respected that, in the complicated way you respect something that doesn't make you feel better about the larger situation. Kevin Solis got his notice in a closed meeting with Jenna and his direct supervisor. He cried briefly, and then stopped himself, and then asked what the retraining would involve. Jenna considered that response encouraging enough to note it in the meeting summary. Marcus Webb signed his formal record notation without comment. By noon on Thursday, it was done. Or that part of it was done. Well, at 2 in the afternoon, Ethan went down to the lobby. He didn't announce it. He took the elevator from 42 and walked out into the marble and the hum of the waterfall and the foot traffic of a Thursday afternoon, and he stood near the reception desk, which was staffed today by the young man he'd seen on Tuesday, the one with the headset who'd been on a call, and he just stood there for a while. Nobody recognized him immediately. A few people glanced at him, the way people in lobbies glance at each other, registering presence, moving on. He was wearing the same jacket he'd worn Tuesday, because it was his jacket, and he wore it until it wore out, and he hadn't yet gotten around to doing laundry. The young man at the desk looked up. "Can I help you?" he said, politely, directly. No assessment in his eyes that Ethan could detect, just the basic, functional attention of someone doing his job. "I'm just observing," Ethan said. The young man, his lanyard said Ryan T., Guest Services, looked at him for a second, uncertain whether just observing was a normal thing for a lobby visitor to say, and then apparently decided it wasn't his problem and went back to his screen. Ethan watched the lobby for 20 minutes. He watched 3 visitors checked in without incident, scanner used, passes issued, escorts called. He watched a delivery come through the service door. He watched a cluster of employees in Vertex lanyards badge through the turnstiles without breaking stride. He watched Ryan handle a phone call and a walk-in simultaneously with the specific controlled attention of someone who was good at his job and knew it and didn't need to perform the knowing. He thought about what Dale had said. That's every day. Not every interaction, not most of them, but enough of them. Enough that a security guard who'd been watching for 9 years had stopped being surprised somewhere around year 3, and that stopping was itself the problem. The specific, gradual, entirely invisible problem of people adjusting to something that should never have become normal. He left the lobby the way he'd come in on Tuesday. Through the front doors, into the October afternoon, the air colder now than it had been 2 days ago. The sky, the particular gray of a city that was deciding whether to rain. He stood on the sidewalk outside his company's headquarters and looked at the building. 44 floors of glass and steel, with his name on the corporate filings, and his decisions embedded in every floor plan. And he thought about the question from the Meridian Room, the one he'd asked and nobody had answered. If I had truly been an ordinary visitor, would anyone here have treated me with respect? He still didn't know the full answer, but he was starting to understand the shape of what it would take to make the answer yes, reliably, on any given Tuesday. The all-staff communication went out Friday morning. It was not a standard company bulletin. It was not written in the flattened, institutional, passive voice that most corporate communications defaulted to. The voice that said, "It has come to our attention, and steps are being taken," and managed to communicate urgency and accountability while somehow implicating nobody. Ethan had written this one himself too, and Raymond had read it and said, "This is going to surprise people." And Ethan had said, "Good." And Raymond had said, "I mean that as a potential concern." And Ethan had said, "I know." It went to every Vertex Dynamics employee at every location, all 4,300, across 11 offices, in every time zone. It came from Ethan's address, with his name at the bottom. It described what had happened on Tuesday. Simply, without euphemism. I entered our headquarters through the main lobby, presented valid identification, and was denied access and asked to leave my own building by multiple members of our staff. The denial was based entirely on my appearance, not on procedure. Our verification procedure, had it been followed, would have resolved the situation in under 60 seconds. On my appearance, on whether I looked, to the people making the judgment, like the kind of person who belonged. It described the HR review. It named the outcomes without naming individuals. 2 staff members have been terminated, others have received formal disciplinary actions, because the specifics of personnel actions were not public, but the fact of them was. And then it asked the question, the same one from the Meridian Room, now in writing, to 4,300 people. I want every person reading this to sit with a question. If you saw an unfamiliar person in your workspace today, Someone who didn't look the way you expected. Someone whose presence surprised you. What would your first instinct tell you? I'm not asking whether you'd follow procedure. I'm asking what you'd feel before procedure. Because what we feel before procedure is what shapes how we apply it. And that's the part of this that policy alone can't fix. He had written and rewritten that paragraph 6 times. The 6th version was the one he sent. The responses started coming in within an hour. Most of them were what he expected, expressions of concern, support, surprise, the particular discomfort of employees. Processing something uncomfortable about the organization they worked for. Some of them were defensive. A few were angry, which he also expected. People who felt implicated by a company-wide letter about bias, and who expressed that feeling through anger because it was easier than the alternative. But some of them were the other thing. A warehouse supervisor in Charlotte wrote, "I've been here 6 years and I've been trying to figure out how to say something about the way our team handles certain contractors versus others. I never knew how to raise it. This gives me a starting place." A software engineer in the Amsterdam office wrote, "This is the first time in 4 years of working here that something from leadership has made me feel like the company I work for is the same one I signed up to work for." A woman in accounts receivable, 3rd floor, whose name Ethan didn't recognize, wrote a single sentence, "Thank you for not pretending it didn't happen." He read every response that came to his direct address. There were 63 of them by end of day Friday. He did not reply to all of them. There wasn't time, and some of them didn't need a reply. They just needed to have been sent. But he read everyone, and he made notes in the margin of the legal pad about patterns he saw, about the specific things people named as concerns, about the texture of what 4,300 people apparently felt was true about the company they worked for. It took him until 10:30 Friday night. Marcus had fallen asleep on the couch sometime around 9, a book open on his chest, and Ethan had covered him with the blanket from the arm of the sofa without waking him and gone back to the kitchen table and the legal pad. He read the last response, from a facilities coordinator in the Houston office, who wrote very simply, "I've been dismissed in the same way many times. I always thought it was just me. I'm glad to know someone saw it." And he set the phone down and sat in his kitchen at 10:30 on a Friday night and was quiet for a moment. He thought about what it cost a company to do what this company had apparently been doing, not dramatically, not obviously, but in the accumulated texture of daily interactions. To the people who worked for it and passed through it and stood in its lobby asking for basic procedural correctness. The cost wasn't on any spreadsheet he'd ever reviewed. It didn't show up in the quarterly reports or the operational metrics or the employee satisfaction surveys that were carefully worded to not actually ask the difficult questions. But it was real. He could feel the weight of it in 63 emails. He flipped the legal pad to a fresh page. At the top he wrote, "What needs to change? Not eventually, now." And underneath that he wrote the first item, which was not a policy and not a procedure and not a training module. It was a meeting, a specific kind of meeting, in a specific configuration that he had not held in the 11 years since the company had grown large enough that he'd stopped being able to hold it. He was going to go floor by floor, not with a message or a bulletin or a company-wide communication, in person. With whatever group of people happened to be working that floor on whatever day he showed up, in whatever room was available, and he was going to ask the question he hadn't asked in too long. What do you see every day that you haven't been able to say? It was going to take weeks. It was going to be inefficient and time-consuming, and Raymond was going to point out, correctly, that there were more scalable ways to gather employee feedback. Ethan knew all of that. He also knew that Tuesday had happened because the distance between what was happening in this company and what was visible to the people responsible for it had grown too wide, quietly, over too much time, and that the only thing that closed that distance was proximity. Actual, physical, show-up-in-your-jacket proximity. He'd learned that in a converted warehouse 22 years ago, and he'd let the learning drift somewhere in the years since, buried under the growth and the expansion and the 44th floor with its city view and its good furniture. He was done letting it drift. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing what cities do after 10 on a Friday. Still running, still lit, never entirely quiet. Marcus was asleep on the couch with a book on his chest. The mortgage had 11 years left on it. The Silverado needed new brake pads, and he kept forgetting to deal with that. Everything was ordinary and specific and real, the way life is when you're paying attention to it, And Ethan Holloway sat in his kitchen and wrote 4 pages of notes until his hand cramped, and then he stopped, capped the pen, and went to check that his son was still breathing the way parents do when kids fall asleep somewhere other than their beds. Not from worry, just from the reflex of it, the simple animal need to confirm that the most important thing is still okay. Marcus was fine. The book had slid off his chest to the cushion. Ethan picked it up and looked at the cover. Something about ocean exploration, dog's-eared halfway through, and set it on the coffee table where Marcus would find it in the morning. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He had a lot of work to do, and it was going to start early. He started on the 6th floor. Not the top, not the bottom, not any floor that carried symbolic weight or institutional visibility. The 6th floor housed the data infrastructure team and part of the procurement department, about 60 people in an open-plan space with too many monitors and not enough natural light, and a break room that smelled permanently of microwaved soup. Raymond had suggested starting somewhere more visible, maybe the product teams on 15 or the communications group on 20, somewhere the optics would be cleaner. Ethan had said no. He started on 6 because 6 was ordinary, and ordinary was where the truth lived. He showed up on a Monday morning without advance notice, which by this point in his career he understood was the only way to show up if you wanted to see what was actually there. He walked in at 9:15, found the floor manager, a woman named Bet Sandoval, 47, who had been with Vertex for 8 years, and who looked at him with the particular expression of someone running a rapid calculation about what the founder showing up unannounced on a Monday morning might mean for her specifically, and said, "Is there a room I can borrow for an hour? I want to talk to your team." Bet said, "The small conference room's free until 11. "That works," Ethan said, "whenever people have a minute." It took about 20 minutes for the room to fill, not because people were reluctant, but because you can't pull 60 people off their work simultaneously without consequences, and Ethan wasn't asking anyone to do that. They came in ones and twos with coffee cups and the slightly uncertain energy of people who didn't know what this was yet. They filled the chairs and then the wall space and then the doorway, and Ethan stood at the front of the room without notes, without a presentation, without anything except the legal pad he'd been carrying all week, like a talisman. He said, "I'm not here to talk about Tuesday. You've all heard about Tuesday. I'm here because Tuesday told me something about this company that I should have known before Tuesday, and I want to understand it better. So I'm going to ask you something, and I want real answers. And I want you to know that real answers are not going to have consequences for any person in this room." He paused. "What do you see every day that you haven't been able to say?" The room was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then a man near the back, young, maybe 28, with the specific pallor of someone who spent most of his working hours in front of screens, raised his hand halfway and said, "Are you recording this?" "No," Ethan said. "Okay." A pause. Then, "The way contractors get treated in this building is different from the way employees get treated. Different desk check-in, different badge process, different elevator access. It's not policy exactly. It's just how it happens. And some of those contractors have been working in this building longer than I have." Someone else. "The performance review system flags absences, not late submissions, not missed deadlines, absences. So people come in when they're sick because they're afraid of their attendance record, and then everyone gets sick, and projects still get delayed anyway, except now it's because half the team has a fever." A woman from procurement, sitting against the wall with her arms crossed in the posture of someone who had opinions she'd been holding for a while. There's an unspoken hierarchy on which departments get resources quickly and which ones wait. And it doesn't follow any logic I've been able to find. It just follows who's asking. They kept going. For 50 minutes, they kept going. Not complaining. That was the thing that struck Ethan most afterward, when he thought back on it. There's a specific quality to complaint, a particular rhythm of grievance, and this wasn't that. This was closer to testimony. People describing things they'd observed accurately, without drama, in the voice of people who had been waiting for someone to ask the question that actually fit the answer they'd been holding. He filled 4 pages of the legal pad. He said thank you and meant it. Not the reflexive managerial thank you that meant this meeting is ending, but the actual thing, said to 60 people who had just given him something valuable at some cost to themselves. He went back the next day, and the day after, and for the 3 weeks that followed. Floor by floor. conference room by conference room. The legal pad filled up, and he started a second one, and the second one filled up too, and he started keeping a running document on his laptop that Raymond helped him organize, because by the second week the volume of information was significant enough that the legal pad system was becoming inadequate. What emerged was not a surprise exactly, or it was a surprise in the way that things are surprising when you suspected them but didn't want to confirm them. The culture of Vertex Dynamics had, over years of growth and management turnover and the particular institutional drift that happens when a company scales faster than its values can keep pace with, developed a set of unwritten rules that ran alongside the written ones and frequently contradicted them. The written rules said, all visitors get verified through the badge scanner. The unwritten rule said, use your judgment about who actually needs that. The written rules said, all employees have equal access to the HR escalation process. The unwritten rule said, certain departments' complaints get resolved faster, and everyone knows which departments those are. The written rules said, performance is evaluated on results. The unwritten rule said, performance is evaluated on visibility, and visibility is evaluated on a set of criteria that nobody had ever formally written down because formally writing them down would have required acknowledging they existed. These were not the rules anyone had designed. They were the rules that had grown in the space between intention and execution, the way things grow in gaps, slowly, without drama, and with such gradual normality that people stopped being able to see them as separate from the walls they grew on. Dale had said it. I should have been more surprised by it than I was. That was the sentence Ethan kept returning to, not because it indicted Dale, it didn't, not really, but because it named the mechanism exactly. The specific way that wrong things become invisible, not through deception, not through conspiracy, but through the slow accumulation of days in which nothing is called wrong, and so nothing gets corrected, and so eventually nothing registers as wrong to call. He brought what he'd found to Victoria. They sat in her office, not his, hers, which she'd suggested and which he'd accepted because it was her company to run in the daily operational sense, and he wanted that to be structurally clear even in the small geography of where conversations happened. And he put the legal pads on her desk, and she looked at them and then at him. How bad? She said. It's not bad in the way that means the company is broken, he said. It's bad in the way that means the company has been running on assumptions nobody's been examining. He paused. That's fixable, but it takes longer than a policy revision. What does it take? Consistency, he said, over time, which is the boring answer, but it's the real one. He leaned forward. We need to rebuild the training from the foundation, not patch the visitor protocol. Rebuild what we teach people about the difference between policy and judgment and why the policy exists instead of just what the policy says. He paused. And we need a way for people to say things before they become Tuesday, before the thing that everyone has noticed but nobody's been able to name gets big enough to show up in a lobby incident. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She looked out her window. She had the south-facing view, which meant she looked out over the older part of the city, the lower buildings, and the river in the distance. I want to be part of building that, she said, not overseeing it from here, actually building it. Good, Ethan said, because I need someone who knows how this organization actually functions, and that's you. She looked at him. You could have started with that. I'm telling you now. She almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that meant she was taking the work seriously enough that full smiling felt like the wrong gear. What's the timeline? 90 days for the first phase, Ethan said. Revised training modules company-wide, new escalation pathways for employee concerns, and a formal review of the visitor verification process, with a specific focus on why the existing process failed and what structural change prevents that failure. He paused. The second phase is longer, 18 months probably. Cultural change doesn't have a 90-day version. Anyone who tells you it does is selling something. And where do you want to start? Victoria asked. We already started, Ethan said, 3 weeks ago on the 6th floor. The formal address to the company came on a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks after Tuesday. It wasn't a bulletin. It was a live address, broadcast simultaneously to every Vertex office, every location, every time zone, with a recording available afterward for anyone who couldn't attend live. Ethan had considered doing it from the 42nd floor, from his office with its city view and its good furniture, And then he decided against it because the setting would communicate something he didn't want to communicate, and so he did it from the lobby, from the exact spot where he'd stood 6 weeks ago. He stood there in a different jacket, not because someone had told him to, but because his regular one was finally in the wash. And he looked at the camera that Raymond's team had set up near the reception desk, and he said what he'd been working toward since the night he sat at the kitchen table with 63 emails and a cramping hand. He said, 6 weeks ago I stood in this lobby for 42 minutes and was told, in various ways by various people, that I didn't belong here. Not in those words. Nobody said those words. But that was the message, and it was communicated efficiently and consistently by everyone involved except one person. He paused. I want to talk about why I think that happened, and what I think it tells us about this company, and what I've found in the 6 weeks since. He talked for 32 minutes. He talked about the floors he'd visited and what people had told him. He talked about the gap between written policy and operational reality, without bureaucratic language, without softening it into something more comfortable than it was. He talked about what he'd learned from Dale Pruitt, not by name because he'd asked Dale's permission, and Dale had said he'd rather not, and Ethan respected that. But he described the position accurately, a person who had done the right thing within the constraints available to him, and had stayed constrained by a hierarchy that shouldn't have constrained him. He said, every organization develops habits. Most of those habits are invisible by the time they're fully formed, because by then they're just how things work. The dangerous ones are the habits that feel like judgment, that feel like experience, that feel like you're reading a situation correctly, when what you're actually doing is applying a pattern you absorbed so gradually that you forgot it was a pattern and started thinking it was instinct. He paused. What happened in this lobby was instinct. It was fast, it was confident, and it was wrong. And the reason it could happen that fast, that confidently, is that nothing in our culture had taught the people involved to slow down and ask themselves where the instinct came from. He talked about what was changing. He was specific in the way that corporate communications rarely are, because specificity requires accountability, and accountability is uncomfortable. New training, rebuilt from foundation. A formal concern escalation pathway that did not route through direct management chains, because direct management chains were where concerns went to die quietly. A quarterly review process for the visitor verification protocol, and 6 other operational procedures that the floor conversations had identified as vulnerable to the same kind of drift. He said, none of this is the result of me being angry about what happened to me. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a person who was humiliated and is now reorganizing a company in response to that humiliation. That would be a terrible reason to make organizational changes, and it would make bad changes, and it would be about me, and this is not about me. He looked at the camera. I came back to this building 6 weeks ago to find out what was true. What I found was more specific and more structural than I expected. The changes we're making are a response to that, to the truth of it, not to my feelings about it. He said one more thing before he finished. He said, I want to talk about respect, not professionally, not in the HR training sense of the word, not the kind that goes in a handbook. I mean the actual thing. The experience of being treated as if you are worth someone's full attention, as if your presence in a space is legitimate until proven otherwise, as if the question of who you are matters more than the first impression of what you look like. He paused. That's not a complicated thing to offer someone. It takes maybe 30 extra seconds. It costs nothing. And the absence of it, the way it feels to stand somewhere and be assessed and found wanting before you've said a word, that cost is enormous, and it lands on people who are already paying other costs, and it accumulates in ways that are invisible to everyone except the people carrying it. He let that sit for a moment. We owe every person who walks through our doors that 30 seconds. Every contractor, every vendor, every maintenance worker, every person who doesn't look the way someone's assumption said they should look. That's not a favor. That's a floor. That's the minimum of what a company with our resources and our stated values should be offering, every day, as a matter of course. He thanked them and ended the broadcast. He stood in the lobby afterward, in the quiet of the building after the live feed cut, and he looked at the reception desk and the turnstiles and the waterfall on the east wall. Ryan, who was on duty, looked at him from behind the desk. That was good, he said, simply, not sycophantically, just an assessment. Thank you, Ryan, Ethan said. The part about the 30 seconds, Ryan said. I'm going to think about that. Me too, Ethan said. Okay. Dale Pruitt's file received a formal commendation, entered into the permanent record by Jenna Okue and co-signed by Ethan. It described, in the specific and documented language of an HR record, the conduct of an employee who had maintained professional standards and procedural integrity under conditions that made doing so difficult, and who had demonstrated through his conduct that correct behavior does not require authority, only character. Ethan also arranged, through Raymond and without fanfare, a reclassification of Dale's position. Not a title change, Dale had said, when Ethan raised it, that he didn't care about titles, but a salary adjustment that reflected 9 years of consistent performance and put him in a bracket that made the mortgage and the hip replacement less of a calculation. It wasn't a reward, exactly. It was a correction. The distinction mattered to Ethan. Dale came to his office once more, 2 weeks after the broadcast, to say thank you. He stood in the doorway with his cap in his hands the way he had in the second-floor conference room, and he said, "You didn't have to do the salary thing." "I know," Ethan said. "I wasn't looking for—" "Dale." Ethan looked at him. "I know you weren't. That's why it made sense to do it." Dale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the office, the 42nd floor, the south-facing city view, the stacks of legal pads and quarterly reports, and the photograph of Marcus at 9 years old, looking unimpressed by assembly line machinery. "Can I ask you something?" Dale said. "Sure." "Why didn't you just identify yourself?" he said. "At the desk, right at the beginning. It would have been over in 10 seconds. Ethan thought about this, not because he didn't have an answer. He'd had an answer since roughly 11:53 on the Tuesday morning in question, but because he wanted to give Dale the real one, which was slightly more complicated than the simple version. "Because I've done that before," he said. "In other contexts, other buildings, other situations over the last 22 years. Identified myself, ended the discomfort, moved on. And every time I've done that, I've learned exactly nothing about the thing that caused the discomfort." He paused. "The company didn't need me to identify myself. The company needed to see what happened when it was faced with an ordinary person asking for ordinary procedural correctness. Because ordinary people can't identify themselves out of that situation. They don't have a phone call they can make." He looked out the window. "I did it wrong for 20 years. I kept identifying myself. And because I could, because I always could, I never had to see what happened when someone couldn't." Dale absorbed this. "That's a hard thing to know about yourself," he said. "Yes," Ethan said. "It is." Dale nodded. He put his cap back on. He looked briefly like he was going to say something else, and then he decided against it and said, "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." "Ethan." "Yeah," Dale said. "Right." And he left. Marcus asked about it again 3 weeks later. They were in the Silverado. New brake pads, finally. The pedal feeling different enough that Ethan noticed it every time. Driving back from one of Marcus's Saturday soccer games, which Marcus's team had lost 4-1, which Marcus was processing with the particular quiet of someone who was disappointed and not yet ready to talk about it. They were almost home when Marcus said, without looking away from the window, "Did it get fixed?" "The company?" "Yeah." Ethan considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Not the comfortable version of the answer, not the reassuring one, not the one that wrapped everything up and told an 11-year-old that problems get solved and everything works out. "Parts of it are getting fixed," he said. "The specific parts that broke in a specific way. Those are being addressed. The bigger part is harder." He paused. "You can fix a policy in 90 days, the thing underneath the policy, the part that tells people how to use their judgment, that takes longer, that takes people deciding, day after day, to pay attention to where their assumptions come from. And you can't make a rule for that. You can just keep reminding people that it matters, and you can make sure that when they get it wrong, there's a real consequence, and when they get it right, that gets noticed too." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Is it going to work?" he asked. "I don't know," Ethan said. "I think so. I'm going to keep showing up until it does, and then I'm going to keep showing up after that to make sure it stays." Marcus considered this. "That sounds like a lot of work." "It is." "Why don't you just—" He stopped, started again. "Why don't you get other people to do it?" "I do get other people to do parts of it," Ethan said. "That's part of it too. But the showing up, the walking into a floor and asking what's wrong and sitting in a room and actually listening, You can't delegate that and have it mean the same thing. People know the difference between their boss showing up and a representative of their boss showing up. It lands differently. He glanced at his son. When you've got a problem and you want to talk about it, who do you want to tell it to? Marcus shrugged. You, I guess. Why not your teacher? Because, he stopped. Because you're actually going to do something about it. That's part of it, Ethan said. The other part is that when someone who matters shows up and listens, it tells you that the thing you're dealing with is worth listening to. It changes what you think of your own problem. He turned onto their street. That's what I was trying to do. Tell 60 floors of people that what they see and what they know is worth someone showing up for. Marcus was quiet for the rest of the drive. He got out and got his bag and went inside, and Ethan parked and sat in the truck for a minute in the driveway. The brake pedal felt solid now, reliable. The kind of solid you don't notice except as the absence of the anxiety that used to be there. He got out and went inside. 12 weeks after Tuesday, the lobby of Vertex Dynamics was the same lobby. Same marble floors, same brushed steel letters, same waterfall on the east wall that Ethan had still not gotten around to removing and had begun to suspect he never would, because at some point inertia becomes a decision. What was different was not visible in the architecture. A new visitor verification standard was in effect, not a stricter one, not a more elaborate one, but a cleaner one, with the steps spelled out in the order they were meant to happen, and the reason for each step documented alongside the step, so that the people following it understood what they were protecting and why, rather than just following instructions they'd been handed without context. The training module that accompanied it had been built by a team that included Ryan from guest services, 2 security staff members, and a representative from facilities, because Ethan had insisted that the people who did the work every day be part of designing the standard they were being held to. Ryan had told him, after the first training session, that it was the first time anyone had asked him how the front desk actually worked. Ethan had made a note in the legal pad. The concern escalation pathway was live, a direct digital channel, reviewed weekly by a rotating panel that included Jenna Okuwu and 2 department heads, routed around direct management chains, with a commitment to documented response within 10 business days. In the first month, it received 41 submissions. Not all of them were resolvable, and Ethan had been clear in the broadcast that the pathway wasn't a promise that every concern would be fixed, only that every concern would be heard and responded to. But 41 submissions in a month told him that people had been holding things, and that the channel was real enough to trust. He walked through the lobby on a Wednesday morning in January, back from 2 days in the Chicago office, the Silverado smelling of highway miles and the last of someone's drive-through coffee, and he stopped at the reception desk. Ryan looked up. "Morning," Ethan said. "Morning, Mr. Holloway." A pause. "Ethan, sorry." "It's fine." Ethan looked at the lobby. Mid-morning, moderate traffic, everything functioning the way it was supposed to function. "How's it going down here?" Ryan thought about this, actually thought about it, the way people do when they're asked a question they don't usually get asked. "Better," he said. "The new training helped. People know the steps now, and they know why, which makes the steps feel less like," he looked for the word, "less like rules you follow because you'll get in trouble if you don't. More like something that's actually there for a reason." "Good," Ethan said. He passed through the turnstile, badge scanned, green, instant, and headed toward the elevator. He thought about what Raymond had said, a week after the broadcast, when the first batch of concern submissions had come in and the training revision was underway and the floor conversations were wrapping up. Raymond had said, "You know this isn't going to last on its own." Not pessimistically, Raymond was not a pessimist by nature, just accurately. Culture changes last when the systems that hold them last, and systems drift. Ethan had said, "I know." So what keeps it from drifting? The same thing that's always kept anything from drifting, Ethan had said. People who pay attention, and consequences when they stop. He'd paused, and someone who keeps showing up. The elevator arrived. He got in. There was something he'd come to understand in the weeks since Tuesday. Not a revelation, nothing dramatic, just a thing that had clarified like something coming into focus. He'd spent 22 years building Vertex Dynamics into a company of 4,300 people and $22 billion of market value, and 11 global offices and more operational complexity than any one person could hold in their head at once. He'd been proud of that. Still was. The pride was real, and it was earned, and he wasn't interested in performing false modesty about it. But somewhere in the building of it, he'd confused scale with presence. He'd thought that the larger the company got, the more his job was to steer from a distance, to set the direction and trust the organization to follow it, to show up for the significant events and let the daily texture of the company's culture manage itself. He'd stopped being a person in the building and become a name on the building, and there was a distance between those two things that he hadn't seen until Tuesday gave him 42 minutes to stand in it. He didn't think he could close that distance entirely. The company was too large and he was one person, and there were limits to what showing up in person could accomplish at scale. He knew that, but he also knew, and this was the thing Tuesday had made permanently unmistakable, that leadership at a distance only works if you've been close enough, recently enough, to know what you're leading. That the view from the 42nd floor was not a substitute for the view from the 6th floor break room, or from the lobby, or from the particular vantage point of a security guard standing slightly to the left of a situation he couldn't fully fix but refused to abandon. Every organization is a collection of people making judgment calls, hundreds of times a day, in the small and ordinary moments that don't get reviewed or evaluated or written up in quarterly reports. The quality of those calls, whether they come from something real, something worth acting on, that's the actual company. Not the market cap, not the mission statement, not the 44th floor reception area with its brushed steel letters. The actual company is what happens on a Tuesday morning when a man in a muddy jacket walks through the front door and asks for something simple and reasonable, and everyone present has to decide, in the space of about 30 seconds, whether to see him as a person or a problem. Vertex Dynamics had answered that question wrong on a Tuesday in October. Ethan intended to spend however long it took, months, years, the remainder of his working life if necessary, making sure the answer was different the next time, and the time after that, and every ordinary, unannounced, unwatched Tuesday that followed. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in cities. Not all at once, but in increments, a degree warmer here, a week without frost there. The light shifting its angle gradually enough that you didn't notice until one morning you did. Marcus noticed it first because children notice weather the way adults notice bills, immediately and with direct relevance to what they want to do. He started asking about the soccer season again, about whether Ethan could make the Saturday games, about whether the backup cleats from last year still fit or if they needed new ones. The cleats didn't fit. They went and got new ones on a Saturday afternoon in a sporting goods store 2 miles from the house, and Marcus tried on 4 different pairs and couldn't decide, and Ethan, who had a call with the Singapore operations team in 90 minutes, stood in the shoe aisle and waited while his son unlaced and relaced and walked careful test circles on the store's industrial carpet, and he did not look at his phone once. The cleats Marcus chose were blue, which had apparently been a very important criterion that he hadn't mentioned until the choice was being made. They drove home and Marcus put the cleats by the front door where he would definitely remember them, and definitely forget them anyway, and Ethan made his Singapore call from the kitchen table, and outside the window the light had the particular quality of late afternoon in early spring. Not warm exactly, not yet, but trying. He thought about Tuesday sometimes in the way you think about things that change the angle of something. Not constantly, not dramatically, but as a fixed point that you occasionally take a bearing from to confirm your position. He thought about the 42 minutes and what they'd cost the people involved, including himself. He thought about the lobby and the marble floors and the way silence had taken over the room when the screens changed. He thought about Dale standing slightly to the left, calm and steady, doing what he could with what he had. He thought about what it meant to build something, really build it, not just fund it or direct it or put your name on it, but build it the way you build something you intend to last. It meant you had to keep going back, keep looking at it, keep being willing to see when it had drifted from what you intended, and being honest about your own role in the drifting, because drift doesn't happen without someone's inattention, and that someone is usually the person at the top who stopped being close enough to see it. He'd been that person. He could acknowledge it without it being the whole story. It was one part of a larger account, and the larger account was still being written, one floor visit and one training session and one Tuesday at a time. In April, 4 months after the formal broadcast, Jenna Okwu brought him the first quarterly review of the new visitor verification data. She came to his office on a Thursday morning with the same folder and expression combination she always used, and she sat across his desk and opened the folder and said, "The numbers are better. Not perfect, but better." "Tell me where it's still soft," Ethan said. She turned to the second page. The scanner compliance rate for walk-in visitors without pre-registered passes is up to 94% across all domestic locations, 6% non-compliant. Most of those are situations where the scanner itself had a technical issue, not human skips. She paused. The Houston office is the outlier, 81% compliance. Their front desk team has had 3 staff changes in the last 6 weeks, and the new hires went through the revised training but haven't had enough time with it yet. "What's the support plan there?" "We're sending one of the trainers for a 2-day in-person session next week," Jenna said. "Not to retrain, to be present, to answer questions in the moment rather than having people work from a module alone." She looked at him. "That was your idea, actually, from the floor visits." "It was the 6 floors idea," Ethan said. "I just wrote it down." Jenna looked at him for a moment with the expression she occasionally wore when she thought he was being falsely modest and was deciding whether to call it out. She decided against it and moved on. The concern escalation pathway had 67 submissions in Q1. 31 were resolved, 18 are in active review, 12 were outside the pathway's scope and were redirected to appropriate channels. 6 are pending. "What kinds of things are people raising?" She turned another page. "The largest category is workload distribution. People feeling that their team's capacity is being exceeded while other teams are underutilized. Second largest is management communication. Specifically, decisions being made and announced without adequate context, leaving people without enough information to do their jobs well." She paused. "Third is the thing I expected to be first, but wasn't." "Which is?" "How people are treated," she said. "Specifically, differential treatment based on role or department. Not discrimination in the legal sense, or not primarily, but the unwritten hierarchy that came up in the floor conversations." She looked at him. 67 submissions in a quarter, and that's only the 3rd largest category. Either we've already started moving the needle on that, or people still don't entirely trust the pathway yet." "Probably both," Ethan said. "Probably," she agreed. He looked at the numbers on the page. 94%, 67 submissions, 31 resolved. The particular arithmetic of institutional change. Never a clean line, never a single moment of resolution. Always a distribution of progress and lag in the places where the work wasn't done yet. "What's your read?" he asked. "Overall, not the numbers, your read." Jenna was quiet for a moment. She closed the folder. "I've been doing this work for 27 years, she said, and I've seen a lot of organizations go through something like what happened here. Most of them do the visible things, the press release, the policy update, the training refresh, and then wait to see if the problem goes away." She paused. "You didn't do that. The floor visits were not a visible thing. Nobody was watching those. Nobody was going to write about you sitting in a break room on the 6th floor asking 60 people what they can't say. You did those because the information was there and you needed it." "That's what you're supposed to do," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "Most people don't." He looked out the window. The city, in April, was doing something almost optimistic. The trees along the street below pushing green through whatever winter had done to them, the particular stubbornness of things that grow back. "Keep the reviews quarterly," he said, "and I want to see the Houston numbers personally after the trainer visit." "You'll have them," Jenna said. She stood. She picked up her folder. She paused at the door. "Can I say one more thing?" "Always." "The employee responses to the broadcast," she said. "We tracked the engagement data. 91% of employees company-wide accessed the recording within the first 2 weeks. For a voluntary all-hands communication, that's..." She looked for the word. "That's not normal. People watched it because they wanted to, because it said something they needed to hear someone in your position say." She paused. "I don't know if you knew it would land that way." "I didn't," Ethan said honestly. "I just tried to say the true thing." "That's exactly why it landed that way," Jenna said, and left. He picked Marcus up from soccer practice on a Friday afternoon in late April. The season had started, the cleats had been forgotten by the front door twice and recovered both times. And Marcus got into the Silverado smelling of grass and exertion and something that was probably someone else's sports drink, and he buckled his seatbelt and said, "We won today." "Yeah?" 4-2. I scored one of them. "Which one?" "The second one." Marcus turned to look at him with the expression of someone who wanted to be asked about this without having to ask to be asked. "It was from outside the box. Fernanda passed it, and I didn't really think, I just kicked it." "The best ones are like that," Ethan said. Marcus considered this. "That's true," he said, in the tone of someone granting a point they hadn't expected to grant. They drove for a while. The late April light was doing something good to the city. Everything slightly golden at the edges, the streets busy with the particular energy of a Friday afternoon releasing into a Friday evening. "Dad?" Marcus said. "Yeah." "The thing at your company." A pause. "Did you ever find out, not the policy stuff, did you ever find out why? Why they treated you that way?" Ethan thought about it. About Dale's answer, how you talked. About Kevin's answer, the way you were dressed. About the 30 seconds on the 6th floor, the 30 seconds in the break room, the 30 seconds that a man in a muddy jacket in a marble lobby hadn't been given. "Because it's easier to judge what you can see than to ask what you can't," he said. "The way someone looks is immediate. It's right there. And it feels like information, even when it isn't, or when it isn't the information that matters." He stopped at a light. "The problem is that every time someone makes a decision based on appearance, without asking any questions, they don't just get it wrong. They teach themselves that the decision was right. They go home thinking they used good judgment, and the next time they use the same judgment faster because they've confirmed it once." Marcus thought about this. "That sounds like a math problem." "It's kind of like a math problem," Ethan said. "Except the variable you're solving for is a person, and people aren't variables." "What's the variable?" "Trust, maybe," Ethan said. "Whether you extend it first or make someone prove they deserve it." He pulled through the light. "The version that waits for proof is faster. It feels safer, but it makes a lot of mistakes, and the mistakes fall on the same people over and over, and eventually those people stop expecting anything different, and that's the cost nobody's counting." Marcus absorbed this with the seriousness he applied to things he was actually trying to understand, as opposed to things he was waiting out until he could change the subject. "Which version does your company do now?" he asked. Ethan thought about Ryan and the scanner compliance rate, and 67 submissions in a quarter and a trainer going to Houston next week, not to retrain, but to be present. "We're working on it," he said. "That's the honest answer. We're working on it." Marcus seemed to find this acceptable. He turned back to the window. After a moment he said, "The coach said I should practice the outside box shot. He said I've got the angle, but I need more control." "He's right," Ethan said. "You've never seen me play. I saw you kick a ball when you were 7. The angle's always been there." Marcus tried not to look pleased about this and didn't quite manage it. They drove the rest of the way home in the easy quiet of two people who didn't need to fill the space, the city moving past the windows in its ordinary Friday way, and Ethan thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this was the thing you were always working toward. Not the resolution, not the fixed metric, not the completed project. The quiet of an ordinary evening earned by a day of honest work. The specific weight of a problem you've looked at directly and kept looking at, even when looking was harder than turning away. That was all leadership ever was, in the end. Not power. Not the corner office, or the brushed steel letters, or the city view from 42 floors up. Just the willingness to show up. To keep showing up. To walk through the door in your muddy boots and stand in the lobby of the thing you've built and ask, honestly, whether it's become what you intended, and then stay long enough to hear the actual answer. Ethan Holloway had learned that on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in his own lobby with no appointment and no escort, and nothing to identify him except a badge that nobody had bothered to scan. He'd needed to learn it sooner, but he'd learned it now, and he intended to keep knowing it for the rest of the time he had. That, at least, was something he was certain of.